The number of people living in the 13 colonies rose from about 250,000 people in 1700 to approximately 2.5 million by the mid-1770s. Immigration, which is the permanent moving of people into one country from another, was an important part of this growth. An estimated 690,000 Europeans came to the colonies. Also during this time, traders brought 278,000 enslaved Africans to the colonies. Another reason for the growing population was that colonial women tended to marry early and have larger families. In addition, the colonies, especially New England, turned out to be a very healthy place to live compared to other parts of the world. Still, compared to today, life was fragile. For example, women often died in childbirth, and outbreaks of serious diseases such as smallpox were common. Many people died in epidemics or outbreaks that affected large numbers of people. For example, in 1721, smallpox in the city of Boston killed 850 people, or about 15% of their population. Many Americans were born in other countries. They brought with them different languages and different ways of thinking. Yet in the colonies, immigrants became something new and different. They became Americans. They developed a new type of spirit, a spirit of independence. Far from rules and limits of their own country, settlers began to develop their own ways of doing things. Throughout the colonies, people adapted their traditions to new conditions of life. Religion, education, and the arts contributed to this new American culture. Men were often the formal head of the households. They managed the farms and businesses and represented the family and the community. On farms, men worked in the fields and built barns, houses, and fences, and sons might work as indentured servants, rented out by their parents to someone else as an apprentice. An apprentice agrees to work with a skilled craftsperson to learn their trade. Women ran out their households and cared for children. Many worked in the fields with their husbands. Married women had few rights, and unmarried women might work as maids or cooks. Widows and older women who never married might work as a teacher, a nurse, or a seamstress. They could run businesses and own property, but they couldn't vote. The American spirit and the family served as a foundation of life in the colonies. In addition, Americans shared a commitment to education, strong religious beliefs, and an openness to new ideas. In colonial education, colonists valued education. Parents often taught their children to read and write at home. In New England, Pennsylvania, people set up schools to make sure everyone could read and study the Bible. In 1647, the Massachusetts Puritans passed a public education law requiring communities with 50 or more homes to have a public school. So there was a high level of literacy, the ability to read in New England. By 1750, about 85% of the men and about half of the women were able to read. And many of them learned from a book called The New England Primer. Religion had a strong influence in the colonies. In 1730s to 1740s, there was a religious revival called the Great Awakening that swept through the colonies. It's a renewed interest in religion. All right. Ministers called for a new birth, a return to their strong faith. And one of these was Jonathan Edwards of Massachusetts, who gave powerful and convincing sermons. George Whitefield, an English preacher who arrived in the colonies in 1739, inspired worshipers in churches and open fields from New England to Georgia. The Great Awakening inspired greater religious freedoms. It led to the formation of new types of churches. And the new churches placed an emphasis on having personal faith rather than on church rituals. More colonists began choosing their own faiths, and the strength of established official churches declined. The Great Awakening also united colonists from north to south in a common experience. The colonists overcame regional barriers, and this paved the way for the rapid spread of revolutionary ideas and excitement during the struggle. The ideas of preaching Jesus and all people being his children kind of contributed to the idea of all people being equal in America. In the middle 1700s, many educated colonists were also influenced by this thing called the Enlightenment. This movement began in Europe, and it was the idea that knowledge, reason, and science could improve society. In the colonies, the Enlightenment increased interest in science, and people observed nature, staged experiments, and published their findings. Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson were very much influenced by the Enlightenment period. It also promoted freedom of thought and expression and a belief in equality and the idea of popular government or government ruled by the people. Ronald Reagan famously said, that we are only one generation from the extinction of our freedoms. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on to them to do the same. The idea of freedom was important to the American colonists. Freedom of the press became an important issue in the colonial America. Newspapers in colonial cities such as Boston and Philadelphia carried political news and often faced government censorship. And censorship is banning of printed materials because they contain an unpopular or offensive ad. John Peter Zinger was a publisher in the New York Weekly Journal, and he accused the New York governor of corruption. So the governor charged Zinger with a crime and threw him in jail. Zinger argued that the statements written about the governor were true, therefore he claimed he had the right to publish them. The jury found Zinger not guilty. The case is seen as a key step in the development of freedom of press in this country. Colonists were beginning to form new ideas of freedom. They began to think in terms of civic virtue, democratic ideas, practices, and values that form a truly free society. These ideas became the building block of a new nation.